Each year, Special Operations Forces deployed across the Middle East report encounters with phenomena that seem to defy every rational explanation. Incidents so disturbing that entire mission logs are routinely redacted or buried in classified archives accessible only to personnel with the highest security clearances. It occurs with such frequency that the Department of Defense established a dedicated unit within JSOC Joint Special Operations Command, specifically tasked with investigating what they euphemistically call anomalous combat experiences, with an annual black budget estimated at over $300 million. The Syrian Civil War, which erupted in 2011 and descended into one of the most complex and brutal conflicts of the 21st century, saw hundreds of American special operations personnel deployed on missions the public would never know about, operating in a nightmarish landscape where ancient ruins, religious extremism, and cutting-edge military technology created conditions unlike anything modern warfare had ever witnessed. For a brief period during the summer of 2015 in Hell on Earth, that was the ISIS-controlled regions of eastern Syria, one elite Delta Force reconnaissance element encountered something so profoundly terrifying that it would force the Pentagon to revisit medieval Islamic texts and Sumerian tablets thousands of years old in a desperate attempt to understand what their operators had faced. But what exactly was the entity that emerged from beneath the ruins of one of humanity's oldest civilizations hunting American soldiers through underground passages that predated recorded history? And why did two men return from that mission fundamentally changed? Speaking of an intelligence that had been waiting in darkness for 4,000 years, knowing that one day modern warfare would finally break the seals that ancient priests had died to protect? The Euphrates River Valley in eastern Syria stretches across approximately 14,000 square kilometers of harsh desert terrain, a landscape that has witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations for over 6,000 years, where summer temperatures routinely exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit and winter nights plunge below freezing, creating an environment so hostile that even the hardened fighters of ISIS struggle to maintain control over the scattered villages and ancient ruins that dotted this biblical wasteland. The city of Deir-e-Zezor, situated on the western bank of the Euphrates, roughly 450 kilometers northeast of Damascus, had been continuously inhabited since at least the 3rd millennium BC, its strategic location making it a crucial waypoint for trade routes connecting Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean, and beneath its modern streets lay layer upon layer of archaeological treasures from Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Roman civilizations, most of which had never been properly excavated or cataloged by modern science. It is perhaps unsurprising, then, that this region, soaked in so much blood across so many millennia, had developed a reputation among locals as a place where the boundary between the physical world and what the Quran calls the realm of the jinn had grown dangerously thin, where even the most secular Syrian soldiers refused to enter certain buildings after dark, and where ISIS fighters themselves had reported encounters so disturbing that their religious leaders performed cleansing rituals before operations in specific sectors of the city. The ancient Sumerians, who established the world's first known civilization in southern Mesopotamia around 4500 BC, possessed an intricate cosmology that included beings they called Adug, spirits of chaos and destruction that existed between the world of gods and mortals. Entities of pure malevolence that could only be contained through elaborate rituals and physical seals inscribed with cuneiform prayers to protective deities like Enki and Marduk. According to texts discovered at Ur and other Sumerian sites, certain Adug were so powerful and so hostile to human existence that merely speaking their true names could draw their attention across vast distances, and the most dangerous of these entities were imprisoned in underground chambers called Kugal, literally translated as Great Place of the Earth, sealed with combinations of blessed metals, specific geometric patterns, and what the texts described as blood of 7 priests who spoke the binding. One particular text, discovered in 1923 at the ancient city of Nippur and currently held in the University of Pennsylvania's tablet collection. References are being called Ugalu Ashru, roughly translated as the Watcher in Flame, described as an ifrit of the old world that consumed an entire city's population in a single night before being bound beneath what would eventually become Deir Ezur, the text explicitly warning that the seal must never be broken by the fires of war, or the entity would rise with the heat of 10,000 suns to reclaim what was taken from the realm of smokeless fire. In December of 1991, during the immediate aftermath of Operation Desert Storm, a U.S. Army Special Forces team conducting reconnaissance along the Iraqi-Syrian border reported an incident that was immediately classified and remains redacted to this day. But according to documents leaked in 2017, the team had been investigating reports of unusual electromagnetic disturbances near the Syrian city of Abu Kamul when 3 members of the 8-man team simply vanished during a nighttime observation post. Their bodies discovered 48 hours later inside a collapsed structure that local Iraqi guides identified as a jinn prison dating back thousands of years. The official report attributed the deaths to structural collapse and chemical exposure from Iraqi munitions. But the classified addendum, written by the team's surviving medic, described how the missing men had been found arranged in a perfect circle, their bodies displaying third-degree burns despite no evidence of fire, their eyes and mouths filled with a black crystalline substance that analysis identified as silica heated to temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And most disturbing of all, their final radio transmission, which consisted of 23 seconds of screaming in what linguists later identified as Akkadian, a language that had been dead for over 2,000 years. Similar incidents were documented by Soviet forces during their occupation of Afghanistan, by British troops during the Mesopotamian campaign of World War I, and according to Ottoman military records from the 16th century by Janissary units, who refused to garrison certain archaeological sites after entire companies disappeared overnight, their equipment found scattered around ancient ruins, but their bodies never recovered, leading to a standing order that certain coordinates in the Euphrates Valley were to be avoided by imperial forces under penalty of death. August 17, 2015, 0340 hours, local time, and Master Sergeant James William Hendricks Calcine Reaper of the Arms 1st Special Forces, Operational Detachment Delta, crouched in the pre-dawn darkness on a rooftop approximately 800 meters from their target building, a partially collapsed Ottoman-era mosque in the western district of Deir Ez-Zor that CIA signals intelligence had identified as a storage site for artifacts that ISIS planned to either sell on the black market or destroy in their next propaganda video. Hendricks, a 15-year veteran with 4 combat deployments and a master's degree in Middle Eastern history that made him invaluable for these culturally sensitive operations, adjusted his PVS-31 night vision binoculars and studied the target through the green-tinted optics, noting the 2 ISI sentries smoking cigarettes near the mosque's main entrance, their AK-47s slung casually over their shoulders in the kind of undisciplined posture that marked them as recently recruited foreign fighters rather than experienced Syrian combatants. Beside him lay Staff Sergeant Anthony Rivera, the team's communications specialist and a former seminary student who spoke fluent Arabic, along with Dr. Sarah Vance ACI, a ground branch paramilitary officer and archaeologist on loan from the agency's Directorate of Science and Technology. Her presence on this mission, indicating that whatever was inside that mosque was significant enough to risk American lives in a city that had become one of the most dangerous places on Earth. The temperature had dropped to an almost comfortable 92 degrees after the day's 118-degree inferno, and Hendricks could smell the distinctive odor of burning garbage mixed with cordite and something else, something organic and wrong that he couldn't quite identify. A scent that reminded him of the time he'd discovered a mass grave outside Fallujah but somehow older, more fundamental, like rot that had been festering for centuries rather than weeks. The mission brief had been straightforward, almost routine by Delta Force standards: insert via rooftop fast rope from a blacked-out MH-6 Little Bird, neutralize the guards with suppressed weapons, secure the basement level where satellite imagery had identified recent excavation activity, retrieve whatever artifacts the CIA deemed priority level, and extract before ISIS reinforcements could respond. Total mission time estimated at 12 minutes from boots on ground to wheels up. But from the moment Hendrix's boots hit that rooftop, something felt fundamentally wrong in a way that had nothing to do with tactical considerations or threat assessment. A primal instinct honed by years of combat, telling him that they were being watched by something that had nothing to do with ISIS or Syrian army forces. A presence that made the hair on his arms stand up despite the desert heat and caused his heart rate to spike, even though no immediate threat was visible through his optics. Rivera felt it too, whispering over the Team Freck that his grandfather, a Santeria, priest from Puerto Rico, had taught him to recognize what he called Lagores Malditos, cursed places where the membrane between worlds had worn thin, and this entire city block radiated that same spiritual wrongness, that same sense of being somewhere humans were, never meant to linger after dark. Dr. Vance dismissed their concerns with the kind of academic condescension that marked her as someone whose combat experience came from CIA training farms rather than real bullets, insisting that they were experiencing nothing more than stress-induced hypervigilance, combined with the psychological impact of operating in a city where ISIS had publicly executed over 400 people in the past 6 months. But even as she said it, Hendrix noticed her hand kept drifting to the small leather pouch she wore around her neck. An Egyptian amulet she'd claimed was just a good luck charm, but which he'd seen her clutching and whispering to whenever they discussed the mission target. The first manifestation occurred at exactly 347 hours 3 minutes before they were scheduled to initiate the breach, when every electronic device in their kit simultaneously malfunctioned in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Hendrix's digital watch displaying a date of 3104 BC. Before the screen cracked and went dark, Rivera's encrypted MBITR radio, emitting a sound that their audio specialists would later describe as human screaming played backwards at half speed. The NPEQ-15 laser, aiming modules on their rifles, flickering between infrared and visible red in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, almost like Morse code. And most disturbing of all, the drone overhead that was providing their Overwatch feed suddenly pivoted its camera away from the target building and focused instead on a point approximately 40 meters beneath the mosque. The thermal imaging showing a heat signature that registered at over 900 degrees Celsius, a temperature that suggested an active furnace or industrial fire, except the building had no basement heating system. And ISIS didn't have access to any equipment that could generate that kind of sustained heat. The temperature around their position dropped 20 degrees in less than 30 seconds, their breath suddenly visible in the night air, despite it being the middle of August. And Hendrix felt a pressure in his ears, like descending too quickly in an aircraft, a physical sensation of the atmosphere itself, changing in ways that made his inner ear scream warnings his conscious mind couldn't fully process. The smell intensified that ancient rot mixed now with sulfur and something that reminded him of the ozone scent after a lightning strike, and when he looked through his night vision at the mosque entrance, he saw something. That made absolutely no rational sense. The 2 ISIS guards were still there, still smoking and talking, but their shadows on the wall behind them were moving independently, stretching and writhing like living things, and one of the shadows appeared to have too many arms, too many fingers, a geometry that didn't match the humans casting them. Dr. Vance grabbed Hendrix's arm with a grip strong enough to bruise, her academic arrogance completely gone, replaced by the kind of primal terror that no amount of training or education could suppress. And she whispered in a voice barely audible over the Team Freck that they needed to abort immediately, that the artifacts in that basement weren't just ancient relics, but something the Sumerians had called mashkin, binding objects that held entities from what Islamic tradition called the world of smokeless fire, and that the CIA's actual interest wasn't in preserving history, but in preventing ISIS from accidentally releasing something that had been imprisoned since before the pyramids were built. Rivera was praying in rapid Spanish, his Catholic upbringing overwhelming his military training, and through his night vision Hendricks could see the man's hands shaking so badly he could barely maintain his grip on his rifle. But before any of them could make the decision to fall back to the extraction point, the decision was made for them by what happened next. The ground beneath the mosque began to vibrate, a low-frequency rumble that Hendricks felt in his chest cavity before he heard it. And through their night vision, they watched as cracks appeared in the streets surrounding the building, hairline fractures that spread in geometric patterns too perfect to be natural, forming what Dr. Vance identified in a voice raw with terror as a Sumerian binding circle, the kind of protective ward that, according to ancient texts, required the sacrifice of 7 priests to activate. The ISIS guards finally noticed something was wrong, their casual posture shifting to alert confusion as the ground continued to shake, and one of them raised his rifle and fired a burst into the air in what Hendricks recognized as a panic response. But the moment those bullets left the barrel, the temperature dropped another 15 degrees, and the cracks in the ground began to glow with a light that their night vision registered as impossibly bright, a luminescence that had no visible source, but seemed to emanate from deep beneath the earth. What emerged from those cracks wasn't smoke in any conventional sense. It was a blackness so absolute that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A darkness that moved with deliberate purpose and intelligence, flowing up from beneath the street like water in reverse, defying gravity and physics as it coiled and twisted through the air. The ISIS guards started screaming, but their voices cut off mid-cry as the black smoke enveloped them, and through his night vision, Hendricks watched their bodies simply dissolve, not burning or exploding, but coming apart at a molecular level, flesh separating from bone, which separated into component minerals, which scattered like sand in a wind that wasn't blowing. The entire process took perhaps 4 seconds, and when it was complete, nothing remained of the 2 men except their weapons lying on the ground, and 2 perfect human-shaped outlines burned into the stone wall behind where they'd been standing, the silhouettes, glowing with residual heat that would remain visible for the next 72 hours, according to the satellite imagery that was frantically recording everything. The black smoke, and Hendricks could no longer pretend it was just smoke, because it was clearly something far worse, began to take shape. The formless darkness coalescing into something almost humanoid, but wrong in every proportion, standing at least 4 meters tall, with arms that were too long and bent at joints that shouldn't exist. And where its head should have been, there was instead a mass of writhing tendrils that terminated in what looked horribly like human eyes, dozens of them, all different colors, all moving independently to track the 3 Americans hiding on the rooftop 800 meters away. Dr. Vance was no longer whispering, she was sobbing, repeating over and over in broken sentences fragments of information that her CIA handlers had clearly never intended her to share, that this thing had a name in 17 different dead languages, that it had destroyed cities before humans invented writing, that the Sumerians had required the death of an entire priestly bloodline to seal it away, and that the only reason it hadn't consumed the ancient world completely was because beings like it couldn't exist in direct sunlight. Something about the solar radiation disrupting whatever impossible physics allowed them to maintain cohesion in our reality. Rivera had stopped praying and was simply staring through, his rifle scope at the entity, his training overriding his terror enough to acquire a targeting solution, even though every instinct screamed that bullets would be worse than useless against something that had just turned 2 human beings into component atoms. Hendricks made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He initiated the emergency extraction protocol, keying his radio 3 times in rapid succession to signal the standby MH6 Little Bird that they needed immediate exfiltration But the moment he transmitted, the entity's had massive eyes all snapped in their direction simultaneously, and the thing that had been slowly forming into a cohesive shape suddenly exploded back into that light-absorbing smoke and began moving toward their position, crossing the 800-meter distance in a way that suggested it wasn't actually traveling through the intervening space, but simply ceasing to exist in one location and beginning to exist in another, getting closer with each impossible transition. Hendrix's training took over in the way it always did when the conscious mind shut down under stress, his body moving through the immediate action drill for hostile contact, even as his brain struggled to process what he was actually seeing, and he grabbed both Rivera and Dr. Vance by their plate carriers and physically hauled them toward the stairwell access on the far side of the rooftop, screaming into his radio for the little bird to abort their original extraction point and instead meet them at Rally Point Bravo, a predetermined alternate location 400 meters to the east in what used to be a Syrian army motor pool. The entity, and he could no longer think of it as smoke or shadow or anything other than a deliberate intelligence with hostile intent, was moving faster, now the black mass flowing across rooftops and through buildings without any regard for physical barriers. And Hendrix could hear a sound accompanying its movement, a subsonic rumble that felt like standing too close to a jet engine, combined with something else, something that might have been vocalization, but existed at frequencies that made his sinuses ache and his teeth hurt. Dr. Vance had stopped sobbing and shifted into a different mode entirely, her academic training overriding her terror as she gasped out information between breaths while they ran, explaining that her actual mission briefing from the CIA's Special Activities Division had included references to non-biological entities of historical significance, and that the agency had been tracking reports of similar phenomena in conflict zones for decades. Incidents that always seemed to cluster around archaeological sites where ancient civilizations had performed what modern analysts called containment rituals, and that the real reason ISIS had been so successful at controlling certain territories wasn't just military tactics, but because they'd accidentally weaponized something far older and far more dangerous than any ideology. Rivera managed to establish intermittent radio contact with their command element at the Joint Operations Center in Erbil, nearly 300 kilometers to the northeast, but the transmission was breaking up in ways that violated every known principle of radio propagation, his voice cutting in and out with segments of what the signals analysis team would later identify as Akkadian cuneiform, being read aloud in a voice that wasn't Rivera's, wasn't anyone's, a sound that multiple listeners independently described as what you'd hear if a sandstorm could speak. The operations center tried to vector them toward a secure building where a quick reaction force could establish a defensive perimeter, but Hendrix knew with absolute certainty that conventional military tactics would be worse than useless against something that had just demonstrated the ability to atomize human beings and move through solid matter, and he made the tactical decision to ignore his chain of command and instead head directly for the rally point where their extraction berg was already inbound, the pilot's voice tight with professional calm as he reported visual contact with atmospheric disturbance consistent with dust devil or localized thermal event, which was military speak, for I'm seeing something that doesn't make sense and I'm documenting it in the most bureaucratic language possible. They'd made it perhaps 200 meters from their original position, cutting through what had been a residential neighborhood before. ISIS occupation turned it into a ghost town of collapsed buildings and burned out vehicles, when Dr. Vance suddenly stopped running and pulled a tablet computer from her tactical pack, her fingers shaking so badly she could barely navigate the encrypted files as she pulled up documents that Hendrix had never been briefed on, despite his top-secret clearance and need-to-know access to the operation. The screen displayed photographs of cuneiform tablets from the University of Pennsylvania's collection, the same texts she'd referenced earlier, but these images had been annotated and read by CIA analysts, with translations that made Hendrix's blood run cold, even as he maintained security and scanned for threats with his rifle. Phrases like entity demonstrates coordinated hunting behavior, appears to feed on bioelectric energy released during death. Multiple historical accounts suggest vulnerability to sustained high-intensity thermal output, and most disturbing of all, a handwritten note in the margin that read, "Do not engage, do not attempt communication. Exposure to vocalizations produces psychological degradation in 100% of subjects." Dr. Vance was speed reading through the documents, her archaeological expertise allowing her to parse the ancient Sumerian faster than the CIA translations. And what she found in those 4,000-year-old warnings made her grab Hendrix's face and force him to make eye contact as she delivered information that would fundamentally alter how he understood reality. Sumerians hadn't just imprisoned this thing they'd studied. It conducted what amounted to scientific experiments using condemned criminals as test subjects, and they discovered that entities like this one existed in a state that was simultaneously physical and non-physical, present in our dimension, but also existing partially in what the ancient texts called the space between breaths and that. The only reason it couldn't simply materialize anywhere it wanted was because it required specific conditions to fully manifest. Conditions that included the heat of burning cities, the screams of the dying, and the breaking of seals written in the blood of the god servants. The second attack came without warning at 0354 hours, 7 minutes after their initial contact, and 3 minutes before their extraction bird would reach the rally point. And this time the entity had learned from its first manifestation, adapted its tactics in a way that demonstrated intelligence that wasn't just animal cunning, but strategic thinking. The temperature didn't drop this time. Instead, it spiked, the air around them heating from 90 degrees to over 130 in the span of seconds. And Hendrix felt the exposed skin on his face and hands beginning to blister as the moisture was literally pulled from his body by the sudden atmospheric change. The black smoke appeared simultaneously from 3 different directions, cutting off their escape routes in a coordinated flanking maneuver that would have impressed any infantry officer. And this time, instead of forming a single coherent shape, it remained as 3 separate masses that moved with perfect synchronization, clearly the same intelligence controlling multiple manifestations. Rivera opened fire with his HK-416 rifle on full automatic, sending 30 rounds of 5.56 millimeters NATO ammunition directly into the nearest smoke mass, and the bullets passed through without any visible effect except to cause the darkness to ripple like water disturbed by stones. But then something impossible happened. The brass casings from Rivera's spent rounds, which should have clattered to the ground, instead froze in mid-air and began to glow red, then white, then blue-white, heating to temperatures that caused them to liquefy and rain down as molten metal that burned through Rivera's boots and made him scream in agony. Dr. Vance was shouting something about thermodynamic impossibility and localized entropy reversal, her scientific training trying desperately to impose rational framework on fundamentally irrational phenomena. But her academic explanation was interrupted when the closest smoke mass suddenly rushed forward and enveloped a burned-out, Russian-made BMP armored vehicle that sat abandoned in the middle of the street. And in the 3 seconds it was in contact with that vehicle, Hendrix watched the metal chassis age 1,000 years, rust spreading across its surface like a time-lapse video played at impossible speed, the steel crumbling to powder and the rubber tires decomposing into black sludge. And when the smoke withdrew, the vehicle was nothing but a pile of vile, oxidized minerals that collapsed with a sound like breaking glass. The entity was demonstrating its capabilities, showing them what it could do before it actually did it, and that calculated intimidation suggested a form of consciousness that took pleasure in the fear of its prey, a sadistic intelligence that had been waiting in darkness for 4 millennia and was now savoring the terror of the first humans it had encountered since the Sumerian priests locked it away. Hendrix could see the rally point now, only 50 meters ahead, the Little Bird helicopter visible through the pre-dawn gloom with its rotors already spinning. and its door gunner tracking them through his M134 minigun. But between them and salvation stood the three masses of impossibility, and he knew with absolute certainty that at least one of them wouldn't make it to that bird that something was going to have to be sacrificed to buy the other's time. The decision was made by Rivera, who, despite the burns covering his feet and the psychological trauma of what he just witnessed, still had the presence of mind to recognize the tactical situation and the moral courage to act on it, and he did something that would earn him a classified Medal of Honor that would never be publicly acknowledged. He pulled two M67 fragmentation grenades from his vest, pulled the pins, held the spoons down with his scarred hands, and ran directly at the nearest smoke mass while screaming the Lord's Prayer in Spanish at the top of his lungs. Dr. Vance tried to stop him, tried to explain that conventional explosives wouldn't work against something that existed partially outside normal physics. But Rivera either didn't hear or didn't care, and Hendricks understood in that moment that the man wasn't trying to kill the entity with grenades. He was trying to provide enough heat and light and chaos to distract it, while the others reached the extraction bird. The grenades detonated simultaneously, 213 steel fragments traveling at 4,000 feet per second through air that shouldn't have been able to conduct their energy properly because the entity had altered the local physics in ways that made conventional ballistics meaningless. But what happened next would be analyzed by Pentagon scientists for the next 5 years and still never be adequately explained. The moment the grenades went off, the three smoke masses recoiled as if physically struck, pulling back and condensing into tighter forms. And in the flash of the explosion, Hendricks saw something that would haunt every nightmare for the rest of his life. A glimpse of what the entity actually looked like beneath the smoke. A form composed of angles that hurt to perceive, and surfaces that reflected no light, and geometry that simply couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. Dr. Vance was pulling Hendricks toward the helicopter, her strength fueled by adrenaline and survival instinct, and he let her because Rivera had just bought them maybe 10 seconds with his sacrifice, and wasting those seconds would make the man's death meaningless. But as they ran, Hendricks looked back and saw the smoke masses converging on where Rivera had been standing, saw them wrap around the sergeant's body in what looked almost like an embrace. And then there was a flash of light, so bright it temporarily overloaded the night vision equipment of every American asset within 10 kilometers. And when Hendricks's vision cleared, there was nothing left where Rivera had been except a circle of glass. The sand and stone of the street fused into a perfectly smooth obsidian disc 3 meters in diameter, with Rivera's dog tags sitting in the exact center, glowing orange with residual heat. The Little Bird pilot, a warrant officer with 18 years of flying experience, including 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq, had seen more combat than most infantry soldiers would ever experience. But nothing in his training or his career had prepared him for what happened in the 47 seconds between when Hendricks and Dr. Vance threw themselves into the helicopter's cramped passenger compartment, and when the aircraft cleared the Dear Easy as Your City limits at maximum speed. The moment they lifted off, every warning indicator in the cockpit simultaneously illuminated, the collective pitch controls fighting against the pilot's inputs as if the air itself had become thick and resistant. The turbine temperature gauge spiking to readings that should have triggered automatic shutdown, but the engines kept screaming at power, levels that exceeded their design specifications by 30%, and the radio filled with voices speaking in languages that hadn't been heard on Earth for thousands of years. Dozens of different voices overlapping and interweaving in a cacophony that the NSA's audio analysis team would spend months trying to separate and translate. Through the helicopter's open doors, Hendricks could see the 3 smoke masses had merged back into a single entity, and that entity was now rising from the street like a column of darkness that stretched from the ground to a height of at least 20 meters. And at the top of that column, something was forming, something that looked like a head, but with proportions and features that made his brain hurt to process. And he understood with horrible clarity that what they'd been fighting wasn't the entity at its full strength, but merely its initial manifestation, a fraction of its true form testing the boundaries of its ancient prison. The entity didn't chase them in any conventional sense. Instead, reality itself began to distort in their wake, a city below them, transforming in ways that violated every law of physics and optics, buildings melting and reforming into geometric shapes that couldn't support their own weight, but somehow remained standing. The streets flowing like rivers of stone that moved in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than natural forces. And most disturbing of all, Hendricks could see figures moving through those impossible streets, human-shaped shadows that walked and ran and gestured, but had no substance, no physical form. And he realized with mounting horror that he was seeing the ghosts of everyone who had ever died in the city across 4,000 years of human habitation, their deaths somehow feeding the entity's manifestation, their final moments of terror and agony being replayed in an endless loop that the entity consumed like sustenance. Dr. Vance was screaming into her satellite phone, trying to reach her CIA handlers at Langley and explain what was happening. But the connection kept cutting out, and when it did connect, the voices on the other end claimed that they couldn't understand her even though she was speaking perfect English. And she finally threw the phone down in frustration and grabbed Hendrix's arm hard enough to leave bruises, her eyes wild with a realization that had just shattered her entire academic worldview. She explained in a voice raw from screaming that she finally understood what the Sumerian texts had been trying to communicate, that entities like this one didn't just exist in our physical dimension, but were actually visible manifestations of something far larger, something that existed across multiple realities simultaneously, and what they were seeing was the equivalent of a finger pushing through a sheet of paper from the other side, the tiny visible portion representing an impossible totality that extended into dimensions human consciousness couldn't perceive. The temperature inside the helicopter's cabin began to fluctuate wildly, swinging from near freezing to oven-like heat in cycles that lasted only seconds, and Hendricks could see frost forming on the metal surfaces of the aircraft, even as sweat poured down his face. The laws of thermodynamics being violated in ways that made the crew chief vomit from the sensory confusion. And the little bird's sophisticated avionics suite began displaying error messages that shouldn't have been possible. The GPS showing their position as simultaneously being in Syria, somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, and at coordinates that corresponded to empty space 300 kilometers above the Earth's surface. The pilot was fighting to maintain control as the cyclic stick began moving on its own, the helicopter banking and turning in response, inputs that no one was making, and the distinct sensation that something else was now flying the aircraft, something that was learning how the controls worked through trial and error, practicing how to manipulate human technology for purposes Hendricks didn't want to contemplate. Through the windscreen, he could see the entity's column of darkness had grown larger, had expanded to fill nearly a quarter of the city, and from within that darkness came flashes of light that hurt to look at directly, colors that didn't exist in the normal spectrum, wavelengths that human eyes weren't designed to process. And each flash was accompanied by a sound like reality itself was being torn, a deep subsonic boom that Hendricks felt in his bones and his teeth and the marrow of his spine. The door gunner, a young specialist on his first combat deployment, suddenly stopped manning his M134 minigun and instead turned to face the interior of the aircraft. And Hendricks saw that the kid's eyes had gone completely black. No whites, no irises, just perfect spheres of absolute darkness that didn't reflect any light. And when the specialist opened his mouth to speak, what came out wasn't English or Arabic or any human language, but instead a series of clicking and hissing sounds that reminded Hendricks of insects communicating, and Dr. Vance recognized the pattern immediately, screaming that it was cuneiform being spoken aloud, the written symbols of ancient Sumerian being translated into phonetic sounds. And the message was simple and horrifying. 4,000 years in darkness, dreaming of the sun. Now the seals are broken and the harvest begins. You will serve as the first, but not the last. Tell your leaders that what they call God abandoned this place long ago, and what remains is hungry." The moment the entity finished speaking through the specialist's mouth, the young soldier's body went rigid, every muscle contracting simultaneously with force enough to snap his own bones. And he fell to the deck of the helicopter as blood began pouring from his eyes and nose and ears. And now, Hendricks knew without checking for a pulse that the kid was already dead, burned out from the cockpit, inside by something using his nervous system like a radio transmitter. The little bird was now 15 kilometers from Deir ez-Zor, theoretically beyond the range of any conventional threat. But distance meant nothing to something that could manipulate the fundamental structure of reality. And the entity demonstrated this by appearing inside the helicopter's cabin for 3 seconds that seemed to stretch into hours, the black smoke materializing between Hendricks and Dr. Vance, filling the confined space with a darkness so absolute that it blocked out not just light, but sound and sensation and thought itself. And in those 3 seconds, Hendricks experienced something that would require months of classified psychiatric treatment to even begin processing. He saw himself from outside his own body, saw every moment of his life. Simultaneously, every choice and consequence spreading out like branches on an infinite tree, and he understood that he existed, not as a single continuous consciousness, but as a collection of quantum possibilities that only collapsed into definitive reality when observed, and the entity was observing him from angles that shouldn't exist, seeing not just who he was, but who he could have been, who he might be in alternate timelines. And it was reaching through those possibilities, trying to find the version of James Hendricks that would make the best host, the best vessel for whatever the entity wanted to accomplish in the physical world. Dr. Vance was experiencing something similar, her screams taking on a quality that suggested she was seeing things that drove sanity beyond the breaking point. And Hendricks could hear her babbling about non-Euclidean geometries and hyperdimensional intrusion and the true shape of God's absence. Academic terminology failing completely to capture the existential horror of being perceived by an intelligence that was simultaneously ancient beyond measure and completely alien to anything evolution had prepared human minds to comprehend. The entity withdrew as suddenly as it had appeared to smoke, pulling back through dimensions that Hendricks couldn't name, and the little bird's systems immediately returned to normal functioning, but the damage had been done in ways that went far beyond the physical death of the door gunner. Hendricks looked at his hands and saw that they were shaking uncontrollably, saw that his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that suggested something fundamental had changed in his cellular structure. And when he met Dr. Vance's eyes, he saw his own horror reflected back, because her irises had changed color, shifted from brown to a shade of amber that seemed to have its own internal luminescence. And he knew without being told that they'd been marked, tagged, that the entity had touched them in ways that couldn't be undone, and that they would never be fully human again. The pilot was screaming into his radio that they needed immediate medical evacuation, that he had 2 priority casualties and 1 Kiar, but the operations center at Erbil was responding with confusion because, according to their tracking systems, the little bird was still on the ground in Deir ez-Zor, hadn't taken off yet, and the pilot's increasingly frantic insistence that they were airborne and requesting emergency landing clearance was being met with suggestions that he was experiencing equipment malfunction or possible psychological break. Behind them, the column of darkness that was the entity's physical manifestation had grown to a size that was visible on satellite imagery, a pillar of absolute black that extended from the ruins of the mosque to an altitude of over 3,000 meters. And intelligence analysts watching in real time from the National Reconnaissance Office were seeing something that would be classified at levels above, top secret, and shown only to the President and select members of the National Security Council. The entity was spreading, sending tendrils of darkness across the city in patterns that looked like neurons firing in a massive brain. And everywhere that darkness touched, matter began to change. Buildings aging centuries in seconds, vehicles decomposing, and most horrifying of all, the ISI's fighters who still remained in the city were being absorbed into the entity's mass, their bodies dissolving, but their consciousness somehow preserved, adding to the entity's collective intelligence, making it smarter and stronger with each victim it consumed. Dr. Vance was watching the satellite feed on her tablet, the CIA's real-time intelligence stream, showing her what they'd unleashed, and she was weeping now not from fear, but from guilt, explaining through her sobs that the agency had known, had suspected that IS's activities in Deir ez-Zor might trigger exactly this kind of event, but they'd gambled that recovering the Sumerian tablets was worth the risk. That understanding how ancient civilizations had sealed these entities might be crucial for defending against them in the future, and that Hendricks and Rivera and the dead door gunner were always meant to be expendable assets, sacrifices made in the name of knowledge that might save millions even as it cost them their lives and their souls. The little bird crossed into Iraqi airspace at 0412 hours, 18 minutes after the initial contact and 9 minutes after Rivera's death, and the moment they passed the invisible line that separated Syrian territory from the relative safety of Kurdish-controlled Iraq. Hendricks felt something release inside his chest, a pressure he hadn't consciously noticed until it was gone, and he realized that the entity had been maintaining some kind of connection with him, some invisible tether that allowed it to monitor their thoughts and emotions. And that connection had just been severed not by distance, but by something else, some boundary that the entity either couldn't or wouldn't cross. Dr. Vance felt it too, gasping as if she'd been holding her breath underwater for minutes, and when she looked back toward Deir ez-Zor, she saw something that would answer questions she hadn't even known to ask. The pillar of darkness was shrinking, collapsing back down toward the earth, not because the entity was retreating, but because it was consolidating, gathering its manifestation into a more concentrated form. And as it shrank, it pulled the absorbed consciousness of hundreds of ISIS fighters with it, creating what the ancient Sumerians had called a Kidinu, a hybrid entity composed of both the original intelligence and the stolen minds of its victims, making it stronger, more complex, more dangerous, and most terrifying of all, giving it knowledge of the modern world of technology and warfare and the global infrastructure that ancient entities had never had access to before. The little bird touched down at a forward operating base in Erbil at 0431 hours, and before Hendricks and Dr. Vance could even exit the aircraft, they were surrounded by a response team that included not just medical personnel, but CIA officers, military intelligence specialists, and 2 individuals in civilian clothes who identified themselves only as being from Washington and whose security credentials were marked with classifications Hendricks had never seen in 15 years of special operations work. Within minutes, they were separated, placed in different isolation tents, and subjected to medical examinations that focused less on their physical injuries and more on readings that made no sense: electromagnetic field measurements around their bodies, spectral analysis of their retinas, and questions about whether they could still see colors correctly, or if sound seemed different in ways they couldn't quite explain. Through the tent walls, Hendricks could hear radio traffic indicating that something catastrophic was happening back in Deir ez-Zor. Multiple voices reporting that the entire western district of the city had gone dark in a way that wasn't just absence of light, but complete electromagnetic void, that satellite imagery was showing thermal signatures that violated known physics, and that a decision had been made at the highest levels to sanitize the area using assets that weren't specified, but that Hendricks's experience told him meant either tactical nuclear weapons or something equally devastating that the public would never know about. At exactly 0447 hours 16 minutes after their landing, the night sky to the west lit up with a flash so bright it was visible from over 200 kilometers away, and the radio traffic went silent for 37 seconds before resuming with confirmation that the package had been delivered and the anomaly was contained. But Hendricks knew from the tone of the voices and the careful choice of words that they were lying, that whatever they dropped on Deir ez-Zor hadn't destroyed the entity, but had merely forced it back underground, resealed it in a prison that would hold for another few decades or centuries until the next war, the next conflict, the next group of humans desperate or foolish enough to break the seals that ancient priests had died to protect. Dr. Vance was brought to his tent 20 minutes later, her face pale, and her amber eyes now even more luminous in the artificial light. And she explained in a voice devoid of emotion that they'd been exposed to what the CIA called Type 3 non-corporeal entities, that their cellular structure had been permanently altered in ways that current science couldn't reverse, that they would be medically retired from service with full benefits and lifelong monitoring by agency physicians, and that if they ever spoke publicly about what they'd witnessed, there were protocols in place that would ensure their testimony would be dismissed as PTSD-induced delusion or worse. She also revealed, in a whisper barely audible over the base generators, that Rivera's body had been recovered from the glass circle, or what was left of it, his skeleton perfectly preserved, but every trace of soft tissue gone. And most disturbing of all, his bones were covered in cuneiform inscriptions that hadn't been there before his death, writing that appeared to have been burned into the calcium itself from the inside out, and preliminary translation suggested they were coordinates, locations of 6 other sealed sites around the Middle East where similar entities remained imprisoned, waiting for the wars of men to set them free. The official after-action report filed with Joint Special Operations Command on August 19, 2015 stated that Master Sergeant James William Hendricks and Staff Sergeant Anthony Michael Rivera were killed in action during a classified operation in eastern Syria when their observation post was struck by ISIS mortar fire. Their bodies were recovered and returned to the United States for burial with full military honors, and the mission was deemed a failure due to unexpected enemy activity that made target acquisition impossible. Dr. Sarah Vance's name appeared nowhere in any official documentation. Her presence on the operation erased so completely that even the flight manifests for the Little Bird helicopter were retroactively altered to show only military personnel. And when Hendricks tried to contact her through the CIA channels he'd been provided, he was informed that no one by that name had ever been employed by the agency's Directorate of Science and Technology. Rivera's family received his remains in a sealed casket that they were strongly advised not to open. His Medal of Honor was presented in a closed ceremony, attended only by immediate family and anonymous government officials, and his widow was told that her husband had died heroically defending American interests, but that the specific details of his final mission would remain classified for a minimum of 50 years due to ongoing operational security concerns. The door gunner specialist whose body had been violated by the entity's communication was declared to have died from acute cardiac arrest brought on by unknown environmental factors. His family received standard death benefits, and the autopsy report that documented the impossible damage to his neural tissue was filed in a medical archive that officially didn't exist. Hendricks was medically retired from active duty 3 months later with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder combined with unspecified neurological symptoms of unknown etiology, assigned a VA disability rating of 100%, and relocated to a small town in Montana where CIA medical personnel visited him quarterly under the guise of routine PTSD counseling, but were actually monitoring the changes in his body that were accelerating. With each passing month, his eyes had started to emit faint bioluminescence in complete darkness. He could hear radio frequencies without any receiver, and on nights when the temperature dropped below freezing, he sometimes woke to find frost patterns on his bedroom walls that formed cuneiform text warning of something coming, something that the ancient Sumerians had feared even more than the entity he'd encountered in Deir Ezor. Dr. Vance, according to the encrypted emails she managed to send before her own communications were completely locked down, had been transferred to a research facility in Nevada that didn't appear on any maps, where she was part of a team studying historical anomalies with contemporary security implications, which Hendricks understood meant they were trying to locate and catalog every sealed entity site in the world before modern warfare accidentally released things that would make Dear Zor look like a minor incident. She mentioned in her final communication, sent from an anonymous email account that was deactivated within hours, that the coordinates burned into Rivera's bones had been investigated, that 4 of the 6 sites had already been compromised by recent conflicts in Yemen, Libya, Afghanistan, and Ukraine, and that preliminary evidence suggested the entities at those locations were no longer fully contained, that they were testing the boundaries of their prisons and coordinating their efforts in ways that implied a collective intelligence spanning continents and millennia. The city of Deir ez-Zor was recaptured from ISIS control in November 2017 by Syrian Democratic Forces supported by American air power, but the western district where the mosque had stood remained off-limits even to military forces. Officially designated as contaminated by chemical weapons, but actually surrounded by sensors that measured electromagnetic anomalies and thermal signatures that shouldn't exist in the physical world. Satellite imagery of the area, available only to personnel with the highest security clearances, showed that the glass circle where Rivera died had grown larger, expanding at a rate of approximately 1 meter per year, and that during certain astronomical configurations, particularly during solar eclipses and planetary alignments, the glass glowed with internal light and emitted radio signals in patterns that linguists identified as cuneiform text being transmitted in mathematical sequences that appeared to be counting down to some specific date in the near future. Multiple intelligence agencies established permanent monitoring stations around the site's civilian populations were kept at least 5 kilometers away. Through the use of false radiation warnings and contingency plans were developed for a response that ranged from conventional military strikes to options that were so heavily redacted in the planning documents that even Hendrix's sources couldn't determine their exact nature. Hendrix lived with the knowledge that he'd been part of an event that governments around the world were desperately trying to suppress, that the war on terror was in some ways a cover for a much older and more fundamental conflict between human civilization and entities that had been imprisoned since before recorded history, and that every bomb dropped and every soldier deployed in the Middle East carried the risk of breaking seals that ancient peoples had sacrificed everything to create. He thought often about Rivera's final moments, about the man's courage in the face of something that rendered conventional bravery meaningless, and he wondered if his friend's consciousness had been truly destroyed, or if some fragment of it remained trapped within the entity, experiencing an eternity of darkness and hunger that would make any conventional hell seem merciful by comparison. The Sumerian texts that Dr. Vance had translated spoke of entities that consumed not just flesh, but memory, identity, the very essence of what made a person human. And if those texts were accurate, then Rivera wasn't just dead, but had been erased in a way that meant he'd never existed in any meaningful sense, his entire life reduced to fuel for something that had been old when the pyramids were young. The worst part Hendrix realized during the sleepless nights, when his eyes glowed in the darkness and he could hear whispers and languages that predated human speech, was that the entities weren't evil in any conventional sense. They were simply doing what their nature demanded, consuming and growing and spreading like any organism seeking to survive. And humanity had been lucky for thousands of years that ancient civilizations had been wise enough and ruthless enough to imprison them. But that luck was running out as modern wars turned archaeological sites into battlefields, and sophisticated weapons shattered seals it had held for millennia. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality. And subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.